Thank you. It's good to be back home. I get a chance to sleep in my own bed tonight, which is nice. But so we've been going around the state. We were in Nome, Kenai, Anchorage, Fairbanks, now Mat-Su, and we plan to continue this tour here in the next week or so, and getting out to as many Alaskans as possible, just to explain to them what we're trying to do and how we're trying to accomplish what I think everybody wants, and that's how do we deal with this $1.6 billion deficit. As mentioned, there are a number of different discussions going on, both in the House and the Senate, and those discussions will continue. But we got into office on December 4th. We had to have a budget by law on December 15th, and so what we did was we put in the budget that Governor Walker put together before he left office, and then we had to have our amendments to that budget by February 13th. And so we submitted those amendments, made those amendments public, and introduced that bill as the budget on February 13th. And it's caused I think, a tremendous discussion throughout the state. In other words, what do we want to do? How do we want to tackle this issue? And what do we want Alaska to look like moving forward? And so today we're just going to present, once again, our perspective on how to solve this. Not everyone agrees with it. Not everyone agrees with some of the things that will probably come out of the House and the Senate as well. But together, in the end, we've got to bring all sides together, come up with a budget that's going to work for Alaskans. We're compelled by the Constitution to do that, and we'll get that done. I'm sure we will. So we're going to start out by just talking about a little bit about the history of spending in Alaska. I'd be remiss if I didn't warn you that there is a possibility that one or two or more individuals may shout out during this event. It's happened at a few of our other events. And again, we're just trying to explain where we're coming from and then be able to answer questions so folks know what's going on. So looking forward to having the dialogue. I'm going to ask that the first slide go up, please. Hopefully everyone can see this. I know it's going to be tough over there, and I'm going to stand off to the side here if I can. Excuse me? So if you have a booklet, this is going to help. This kind of lays it out. And one of the things that everybody agrees on is that we do have a deficit. We do have a deficit of about $1.6 billion. Everyone agrees that currently we have about $2 billion left in our major savings account, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. We have about $177 million left in our other savings account, the Statutory Budget Reserve. And we have approximately $17 billion in the earnings reserve of the permanent fund. The body or the corpus of the permanent fund we can't touch. So those are the available funds for government to use if they so choose, if the government so chooses to use that. So I want to just talk a little bit about the history and where we are, and this graph really illustrates some of the things that we're dealing with. So back in 69, I believe, 68, oil was discovered at Prudhoe Bay. Prior to that, our budgets were like about $150 million a year for the state, 175. I know it's hard to believe, but times were different back then. Alaska did not have Prudhoe Bay. But once we sold those leases for $900 million, a phenomenon happened that isn't, I guess, shocking, but is problematic. When the leases were sold, we brought in $900 million. We immediately doubled, and then a couple years later tripled the budgets. So as soon as we came in with revenue, we started to double the budgets, grow the budgets, and we really haven't looked back. So in 75, 76, 77, we started to complete the pipeline, and oil started to flow from Prudhoe Bay. When that happened, and we got revenue, which is the blue line, our expenditures followed. At about 81, 82, oil was at about $32 a barrel. We in the North Sea came on pretty close at the same time, meaning Alaska and the North Sea. And this is on the heels of the Arab oil embargoes of the 70s. So the oil was flowing, we were making some money. And then what happens in 1986, if you remember? Oil crashes. It goes down to $9 a barrel. And that was quite a jolt to the economy and really to the psyche of Alaska, because a lot of people didn't think it'd ever come back. And for those of you that were here, you remember those conversations about leaving keys on the table of the house, putting the keys in the mail for the banks. In some cases, the banks themselves failed at that time. So there was concern whether Alaska was going to come back. There was even talk that outfits like AHFC were going to just buy up condos and decommission them or plow them under or whatever. But as we know, we came back. What was interesting about that recession was it lasted only 2 years. The recession we have today is the longest recession in the state's history. and it's still ongoing. It's over 4 years, and we're going to talk about that, why that's problematic, and how spending somehow plays a role in that. So 1986, we hit $9 a barrel. I was teaching out in rural Alaska in a beautiful place called Quo, and our administrators flew in, as they did to all the villages, and they said, we got a serious problem here with the budget. We're going to have to tighten belts. We're going to have to eliminate programs, travel, less positions, et cetera, et cetera. The point being, it was tough. It wasn't easy. It was tough on a lot of us, but we got through it. And then we entered a period, with 89 came the Exxon Valdez, which gave a little shot in the arm of the economy. It was bad environmentally wise speaking, but in terms of the economy, we did get a good shot. So in 89, 90, what happened was, and this is important, our spend stayed about 2.5% a year for quite some time during this time. And the economy was okay. It diversified slowly. We got over the oil shocks of the 80s, and we had pretty consistent budgets during this time. As a matter of fact, in 2006, the budget for the state of Alaska was $2.7 billion. And today it's 5.7, is that right, Donna? 5.7. So in that short period of time, the budget went from 2.7 to 5.7. And then all of a sudden we hit 2006, 2007, and what happens to oil? Goes through the roof. Do you remember that bumper sticker we used to see, please God, give me another Prudhoe Bay and I promise not to do something? That came into this, that bumper sticker came out before this jump in oil. So in some manner of speaking, the prayers were answered. But what did we do with the money is the question, and what happened after that point? So the revenue starts to go up, and what happens to our expenditures? It follows. So we increased our budgets dramatically during this time. From approximately 2007, 2006 to 2013, our budgets increased by about 15% a year. That rate of spend is unsustainable just about anywhere in the world. I mean, China has one of the hottest economies at 6%. So we just kept spending the money that we had. And what we did was we grew programs. We used some of that money, of course, for capital, but we also added programs at this time. If we were to have kept our spend at about 2.5% a year to this day, this delta, or this money that we did spend above and beyond the 2.5%, represents about $29 billion. That $29 billion could have paid for electricity for all Alaskans for eternity if we had built a DC line, let's say from the slope, or for some folks, a dam that would produce electricity. Out in rural Alaska, there could have been renewables, all kinds of ways to generate electricity. We could have used that $29 billion to pay off our pension obligations, our other bond debt. We could have built a railroad to Canada. There's a whole host of things we could have done with that money. As I said, we used some of it for capital and some of it for operating. So what happened after this? Oil crashed again. Went down to about $27 a barrel, $26 a barrel under Governor Walker's first year in office in 2000, when he was elected in 2014. And we've been struggling ever since. Governor Walker tried to fix this budget through a combination of taxes and using part of the PFD. He was unsuccessful in getting taxes passed through the legislature, but his last year in office, there was a bill passed called SB26, which was a percent of market value approach to the earnings reserve, that part of the permanent fund that could be used by government. And under that fund, the amount that could be withdrawn this year is about $2.9 to $3 billion, correct, Bruce? But that $3 billion has to be used for, it could all be used for government, or it's got to be split with the PFD, and that's part of the wrestling match that's going on now with us in Juneau. So here's where we are now, and this is very important. This gap is persistent, and it's been persisting for some time. And it's problematic because in the past 4 years, we spent $14 billion out of our savings to service this gap, because our revenues just are not meeting, our expenditures, our revenues, I should say, are not meeting our expenditures. So a couple of the thoughts, a couple of the plans in play right now by the House and the Senate are not, certainly not the dramatic reductions that we're talking about, but potentially using the PFD, potentially taxes, because really this is the only way we can do it. Use part of your savings, use part of the PFD, tax, or reductions. We made an attempt by putting out our budget to have the dialogue and discussion around reductions. We believe it can be done. We're not saying it can be done easily. There's no doubt about it that when you reduce a budget of this size, in this amount of $1.6 billion, it's certainly going to cause issues for folks. But we believe if we can close this gap, if we can get this gap closed without taking more money out of the private economy, because here's why. We've been in a recession now for 4 going on 5 years. The private economy has shed thousands of jobs, good paying jobs. The economy down south is booming. We've been losing people the last 2 or 3 years out of Alaska to a booming economy. The idea is if you take more out of that private economy to support government programs, it's going to create more of a hardship on an economy that's trying to recover. And so, again, our approach is to reduce the budget significantly, close that gap, and get us through this thing so that we're not using taxes at this stage of the game and we're not taking the permanent fund dividend. Can you go to the next slide, please? This merely just shows that delta again in a different manner, the $29 billion that was spent during this time. What you have here also are 2 hash marks, 2 gray hash lines. And what they represent is, in our Constitution, we have an appropriation limit on the books, and we're going to talk about this, that was put in place in 1981-82 and then reaffirmed in 86 by the people of Alaska. The reason they put an appropriation limit on the books was, you remember that $900 million we spent? People got very concerned back then. The governor at the time was Jay Hammond. The legislature got concerned. The people of Alaska got concerned because they didn't know how much oil was going to be in Prudhoe Bay. They thought it was going to be about $9 billion barrels. Lucky for us, we've already pumped about 17 billion barrels, and we have several billion barrels more, people believe, that we can get out of Prudhoe. But the people were concerned, and so in the 70s and early 80s, 70s and early 80s, we put into place 3 constitutional amendments. One was the permanent fund to save money for future generations because they were concerned we were spending it all. The other was an appropriation limit so we could slow down spending, especially in the operating side of things. And then finally, we had the constitutional budget reserve that was also put in by the people of Alaska. And the reason I bring this up is this was the appropriation limit that was put in. And some contend, and I don't disagree with it, that it was put in with too steep of an incline of spend, and also the formulas really didn't work to be able to operate the way it's supposed to. So in essence, this appropriation limit, the way it was developed, is faulty. If we had put in an appropriation limit that limited our spend to 2.5%, which we are advocating, and folks, this line's a little flat for this. It should have a little bit of an incline, just to clarify. If we have an appropriation limit put in, a spending limit and savings limit that's put in, that spends about 2.5% a year, we could end up saving potential windfalls that come our way in the future. And as you know, there's an investment looking at going to Prudhoe Bay. ConocoPhillips has invested. They're moving west into the National Petroleum Reserve. ANWR is now open for lease sales this fall. So there is a good chance that we're going to come into more oil and more oil revenue. There are some estimates that within the next 7 years, we may see 200,000 to 300,000 barrels flowing through the pipeline, additional to what we have. This is going to bring us more money. And so what we're trying to prevent from happening is the same thing that happened years ago, getting our hands on that money and then spending as much of it as we possibly can. Next slide, please. This is a slide that represents what we have going on now with the permanent fund. We have about $64 billion in the permanent fund. It's pretty good. Compared to a place like Norway, Norway is about $1 trillion. They handle their permanent fund a lot differently than we have. Over on the left represents a model, a theory, that if we had put that $29 billion into the permanent fund, our permanent fund today could be about $120 billion. If it was $120 billion, we probably wouldn't even be here speaking. We probably would have enough money in the permanent fund and using the earnings reserve of the permanent fund to be able to provide the dividend, but also pay for government, pay for the government that we have. But again, that opportunity is gone, it's behind us, and so we're trying to once again work at closing this gap that we have through reductions. Next slide, please. What this shows is a status quo budgeting approach, model. In other words, if nothing changes, if we continue to do exactly what we've been doing the last several years, this kind of lays out what could happen. You see a little purple at the top of these green lines. The purple represents the PFD under SB 26. Remember, it's part of the $3 billion that we can draw out of SB 26. And this is the problem with when you hear some folks saying, all we have to use is the PFD. If we just use the PFD, we're going to be in good shape. The problem is, our incline of spend is not 2.5%, it's about 4.5%. So what's going to happen is, even using the PFD, over the next several years, 4 years, according to this model, at the rate of spend we have going on right now, that PFD and the $3 billion under SB 26 will be eaten up in this growth, in this budget. So then what happens is we go out, we start to take ad hoc draws out of the earnings reserve until finally, and it's pretty far out, 2040 under this model, the earnings reserve disappears, and then we're looking at taxes. Next slide, please. The approach that we're offering in reductions, and again, none of these approaches are easy, would keep a pretty healthy earnings reserve balance in the permanent fund, allow us to still deliver a PFD as historically calculated, and as you see, over the next up to 2037, 38, everything works. We get around 2037, 38, and if there's no changes or no additional revenues through increase in oil, again, this is a model, we may have to start taking some draws out of the earnings reserve. But for the most part, it's in pretty good shape if we reduce the size of the budget. Next slide, please. All this does is just show you in a bar graph what happens over the next couple years with PFD if we don't lower our incline of spend. And this shows you what could happen under the model that we're presenting today. These 3 bars in the beginning represent the payback of the PFD. That's why it looks like it's a larger PFD. Next slide, please. Donna, you want to talk about this just for a second?
Sure.
I want to get a quick drink of water.
I'll come over here. This chart shows our economy compared to the rest of the country. And so it's GDP, which is economic growth. And if you can see the 2 lines, Alaska was doing all right up until the point in time when we stopped balancing our budgets. When we started using our savings to pay for spending rather than reducing savings or finding another way to have revenues equal expenditures. Some people in the legislature will tell you that by spending $2 billion a year in savings, we were pumping up the economy. This evidence shows otherwise. The economy started lagging the rest of the country. While the rest of the nation's out of our national recession, Alaska's been in the longest recession in the state's history. So we would suggest all of that spending of our savings did not help the economy, and in fact, we're sending signals to those who would invest in Alaska that we're not open for business because they didn't know, none of us know, who, how, or when we're going to be taxed next. And that uncertainty is keeping investment on the sidelines. So that rank up in the corner says 50th. Right now we're dead last in economic growth.
So just to the side, I went to an investor conference down in Texas 2 weeks ago, and I generally don't like to travel for obvious reasons. It's not a very pleasant experience when you're 6'7", 6'8". But nonetheless, I went down there, and I was the only governor there. This is one of the foremost conferences in the world for oil and gas investing. Folks from all over the world, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, China, Europe, they all come there. All the heads of the major oil companies are there, but also investing houses are there too. It's a terrific conference. And so I talked with a number of investors, investment houses, and some of the major oil companies. I said, what's the view on Alaska? Because we stay in Alaska oftentimes, you don't get out of state to understand what's going on. Their reply was, you've got some incredible opportunities. And we always hear that because they talk about the oil, but they talked about a couple other things. They said your access to the sea, the North Pacific, and your proximity to Asia is unparalleled in your proximity to the Far East. They said the fact that you are 8 to 10 hours by air to any industrialized place in the Northern Hemisphere is also an advantage. They were really impressed with the infrastructure at Prudhoe Bay because it survived the earthquakes, it's maintained well, same with the Port of Valdez, and more importantly for them, they're pumping so much oil in the lower 48, they're having constraint issues or capacity issues in the pipelines in the lower 48. So they look at Alaska in terms of infrastructure and access to the sea very positively. They also look at the amount of oil we have. And I knew we had a lot more oil, but according to them, we have a lot more than we think. The individual that cracked open the Permian Basin had a little play up on the Hall Road. It's called Burgundy. It's still there, and his partner's running it. Again, this is the guy that opened up the Permian Basin through fracking. They traced back where the oil from Prudhoe Bay and Kapara comes. They call it source rock. I learned a lot down there. I'm not an oil guy, but nonetheless, they're doing some exploration in this source rock, the shale rock. They believe there's billions upon billions of barrels of oil there. So they said, in terms of oil potential, Alaska is back on the map. They're all looking at it. But here's what they said. They said, as Donna mentioned, all of your stuff below the ground is great, and your infrastructure is great, and your access to the Pacific is terrific. But we're going to wait and sit on the sidelines until we figure out what you're going to do to solve this issue with your budget. Are you going to get it solved this year? Is it going to stumble into another year or another year? How are you going to do this? What's your tax regime going to be? What are you going to do with the permanent fund? It's phenomenal. They understand the permanent fund as well as we do, or even better. But nonetheless, they said, although you're getting some investment in Alaska through ConocoPhillips and some other companies, Hillcorp is up there, Oil Search is up there, they said there could be a lot more because they're looking at rebalancing their portfolios according to these investment folks we talked to. And although the Permian is fast money, it's easy money, they don't have the climate issues that we have, they don't have the access issues that we have, they said that they would like to put their money into long-term plays, as they call Alaska. They don't see us as a state. They see us like as an oil province, like the North Sea. So they're real excited about the possibilities, but they're just waiting to see what we're going to do, how we're going to close this gap, and what fashion we're going to do that. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about the 4 areas that this budget hits pretty hard. And we want to have a discussion about that. So this is the Marine Highway System. Since the 90s, the ridership on the Marine Highway System has dropped by about 100,000 people. It's not growing in terms of ridership, it's actually shrinking. At the same time, the receipts that the Marine Highway gets from passengers is dropped dramatically too. I think it's at what now? Is it 30%? 37%. At the same time, up until 4 years ago, we were continually putting money into the Marine Highway System to subsidize it. Now again, there's no doubt that the Marine Highway System serves a function in southeast to south central Alaska and going out to the Aleutians. But the question is, can we make it more efficient? Can we take a look at schedules? Can we take a look at runs to see if we can pull some runs off, for example, in the wintertime? Can we consolidate runs? What are the things that we can do? This is the big question that we're all having the discussions around. Can it be made better? Can there be aspects of it that profitable lines are sold off so that private companies can run them? We are putting out an RFP to get a consultant on board as quickly as possible to examine this as quickly as possible so we can have the answers. But we do know this, that we can't keep subsidizing it at this rate because we simply don't have the money. It's a $1.6 billion issue. It's not that we don't like the Marine Highway System. We're trying to find places where we can save money and also work at getting better outcomes. Next slide, please. This is the university system. I'm going to take another drink here, Don, if you want to talk about it.
All right. Alaska subsidizes our universities more than double the rest of the country. So you can see the subsidies per student. At the same time, the universities aren't raising revenues like other universities, land-grant universities included. While we're doing that, our graduation rates are well below that of the rest of the country. So we have 4-year graduation rates about 10%, which we don't consider a passing grade. So we have challenged the university system to try to reduce its spending and increase its outcomes. We do have a number of campuses, community campuses, which are very efficient and are capable of training people in Alaska for jobs. But the university system has schools that are very, very expensive, and they haven't been raising revenues. So again, duplication of programs, duplication of degrees, there's a lot that they can do. So we've given them a big challenge. Actually increased funding for community campuses in the governor's budget, but reduced the university expenditures quite a bit.
And we're working with the university to get more land. It's because it is a land-grant university. We're also encouraging them to do more in the area of alumni giving. It's one of the lowest in the country in terms of asking the alumni or getting money from alumni to give. And you know, there's a lot of great things about the university. I got my master's from the University of Alaska. I have a daughter that's attending the University of Alaska, both in Anchorage and next year Fairbanks. So we want the university to do well, but the question we're asking all of ourselves now across the board is, can we be all things to all people all the time? And the university is in the same boat that the rest of the state is. They have to answer that question. Can they do the sciences and engineering well? I think absolutely. I think they could be one of the best in the world. Maybe, well, yeah, certainly one of the best in the world in those areas. But can they be the best in the world in everything? The chances are not. And under the fiscal scenario that we're dealing with now, we're all going to have to take a look at what we do and see how we can reduce our overhead. Next. This is just a chart, a graph, I should say, that shows the incline on Medicaid expansion. One of Governor Walker's signature programs when he came in was to expand Medicaid. And we all understand why. We want to make sure that everyone can get access to health care, be healthy, et cetera. But we're just showing you this to demonstrate that whenever we do something and we add a new program, it grows, and sometimes it grows exponentially. And what the different colors show you are the different groups that are in there, from children to adults to seniors. But nonetheless, you can see the growth on this. And Don, if you just want to take a moment and mention what we're trying to do with Medicaid and how we're going to try and work through that.
Yes, yes. So you were saying that the growth is really in adults. We're not looking at the growth in seniors and children that you would think. So we're working with Washington, D.C., with the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services on some very exciting prospects. They're looking at working with us to allow us to change the way that we deliver health care to these populations, so it's more like a commercial insurance or through the exchanges, so that we can continue to serve the population but more efficiently.
Thank you. Next slide. This is a slide that's it's painful to me and it's painful to a number of others. My profession is education. I taught out in rural Alaska. I also worked here in the Mat-Su. I was over at the Mat-Su Correspondence School, Mat-Su Central School for a while. I then ran for the school board and was part of the school board. I think we have a fantastic school district here in the Mat-Su. But what I want to show you here is this, that there are folks saying that increases to the budget have not occurred for some time. The line actually shows the opposite. We had a dip here in 08. We got a little bit of dip up here in 13 and 14. But for the most part, money is being added to education. Last year, I think it was $30 million that was added as well. And so we've had an increase in spending. What I want to show you over here is the results of the NAEP test scores, NAEP, National Association of Educational Progress, that are given to 4th and 8th graders, measuring things like reading, and they're given every other year across the country. In March, the test scores came out, and I think there was only 1 or 2 articles in the paper, and for me this is a problem. Only 1 or 2 articles in the paper. The fact that Alaska is in the red here is as a system, not as an individual school, not as an individual school district, but as a system overall, we're performing worse than any other state system, including states like Mississippi. And what you really want to take a look at here is, as the budget is going up, it's not necessarily corresponding into better outcomes. And this is really a discussion we need to have, and this is what this budgetary process is kind of unmasked, and that's this. While we'll fight like crazy to get the inputs, we'll fight like crazy to get the money put into programs. Once that's accomplished, there's less conversation about what the outcomes are. As we put more money into the ferry system, we need to have more of a conversation about what do we expect out of the ferry system in terms of schedules, efficiencies, et cetera. As we put more money into our health care, what do we expect out of that health care? How is it going to improve our lives? As we put more money into the University of Alaska, what do we expect out of it? We're not having those conversations. And when it comes to education in the state of Alaska, we are putting money into it. We're getting, the outcomes that we're getting as a system aren't where they should be at. So we need to have that conversation. And again, as as people get worked up about how much money is being put into it or not being put into it, and that is a worthy discussion, I wish there was a corresponding discussion as to our outcomes. We've got to get all of our kids reading by grade 3, by 8 years of age. That should be a basic. We should have all of our kids proficient in algebra by the time they leave 8th grade. That's a gatekeeper course for the maths and sciences. We should at least expect that. But Alaska, I think, could do a lot better. We want to have those discussions. Again, the problem is the $1.6 billion deficit. So when people say, if you take money out of K-12 education, how are we going to improve that? We have to have the discussion of how we're going to deliver education potentially a little different. What I mean by that is here in the Mat-Su, and I'm very proud of this school, the Mat-Su, once again, Mat-Su Central School, is the largest school in the state of Alaska. It's one of the fastest growing. And it's one of the more efficient schools in terms of it costs less to educate kids. Now, I'm not advocating that all of our neighborhood schools become like Mat-Su, because we're always going to need schools for certain kids to be in smaller classrooms with a teacher in front of them to work to teach the kids. We're going to need that. But are there opportunities for us? For example, we teach AP courses in our schools, advanced placement. Are there opportunities for those kids to go to the college and possibly go to Mat-Su Central and enroll there, get on an ILP, and be able to use vendors to help with their education if they're independent learners? So I think there's a number of things we can look at, but we have to have that discussion. Next slide, please. Basically, we're just talking about what we need to do and what are some of the ramifications if we don't do things. We're going to talk about taxes in a moment here. But one of the big differences between our approach and the approach of others at this stage of the game is, although the legislature is wrestling with the budget on a year-by-year basis, we want to take care of things so that looking out 5, 10, 15 years, we don't have to go through this again. And that's one of the reasons why we're proposing 3 constitutional amendments. Go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, I keep seeing this young man here, Jeremy. This is Jeremy's son, Lincoln. Some would say he's just trying to figure out what the future is going to be. He's thinking it through. He's built a sandcastle. And really what the sandcastle represents is our budgeting process. Every year we do it 1 year at a time, 1 year at a time, 1 year at a time. So without those constitutional amendments, what we're going to end up with is we're going to be back here every year doing the same thing like Groundhog Day. Do we have enough money? Where do we get the money? Et cetera, et cetera. So what we're proposing through the constitutional amendments is a sandcastle reinforced with concrete, put at high tide, and that's what these constitutional amendments would do. Next slide, please. So we're looking at 3 constitutional amendments, and I've heard people say, you don't want the people of Alaska to vote. And my reply to them is, they're the very people we represent, the people in this room. This is your government. We're your governor, I'm your governor, and you've got legislators. We represent you. Go back in history again, remember what Hammond and those guys did. They went out to the people of Alaska and said, what do you want to do on some of these things? And the people of Alaska responded. We want to save some of the money through the permanent fund. We want to try and hem you guys in on your spending through a appropriation limit. And we want to save some more money in a constitutional budget reserve. So they responded back then. But what I'm asking the legislature to do is to give you an opportunity to vote on this. And let me say this. If they give you an opportunity to vote on this, on these constitutional amendments, and we'll go through them in a moment, and you vote them down, I can live with that because that's what the people of Alaska want, if you vote them down. That the people of Alaska want the PFD to be used for government. That the people of Alaska don't want to be asked if they want to vote on taxes before taxes are taken out of their pockets. And that the people of Alaska aren't really interested in controlling spending. I believe that if you're given the opportunity to vote on these constitutional amendments, you'll probably vote for these constitutional amendments. So let's talk about them for a moment. We mentioned the spending and savings limit earlier in conjunction with the discussion on the amendment that's on the books called the appropriation limit. We'd like to revise that because our spend right now is 4.5% a year. And we really have no controls over spending. So what we would like to do is put into place an appropriation spending limit that keeps our spending down to about 2.5% per year. Remember that chart that had spending from the late 80s to 2006? If we can do that, and it has a savings rule in it as well, and we come into more money, let's say we get more oil flowing, which we anticipate 200,000 to 300,000 barrels over the next 7 years, we can end up banking that money or doing what we said we could do with it. Pay off pension obligations, pay down bond debt. We could potentially electrify through gas, direct current, et cetera, large parts of Alaska to reduce the cost of electricity with cheaper fuel. The next amendment that we want to see go out to the people is, if we're going to tax you, if we're going to take your money, I think at least we should have a conversation with you. So what we would say is this: look, price of oil theoretically has hit $15 a barrel. We have another $1 billion hole in our budget. So people of Alaska, we're going to lay out the cards, show you what the issue is, but we need your help, and we believe that we need to raise taxes either through oil taxes or an income tax, payroll tax, sales tax, whatever it is, and we need your concurrence. If you do that, and we send the vote out to you, we have this constitutional amendment in place, I believe that the people of Alaska will respond to that crisis. I don't think the people of Alaska want the state of Alaska to fall apart. I have a lot of faith in the people of Alaska. So basically what this does is says no tax without a vote of the people, a concurrent agreement with the legislature. Is there anywhere this works? In my opinion, it works in Colorado. In Colorado, you have what they call the Tabor Bill, Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And what happens there is there can be no taxes imposed upon the people without their concurrence, whether it's at the city level, county level, state level. So what has that done for Colorado? Has it wrecked Colorado? Colorado has the second best economy in the nation at this time. The economy is roaring. You have industries like high tech flocking to Colorado. And there's so many folks going there setting up shop that right now in some parts of Colorado they're having a housing problem. So we have folks from Alaska actually going down there to help build housing. But nonetheless, if they need more money, the people of Colorado can vote on that. And finally, the last issue that we're looking at is basically a constitutional amendment that says we're not going to mess with the PFD unless the people of Alaska want that to happen. We want to engage the people of Alaska throughout this process. We believe that if we get these 3 constitutional amendments in place, we are going to have a permanent fiscal plan as opposed to budgeting 1 year, like Groundhog Day, and coming back again and budgeting another year with no controls over it. So this is the major difference between our approach at this stage of the game and the approach of some others in the legislature. Next, please. This just goes through how the plumbing works in some of these constitutional amendments, and you've got it in your packet. Keep going, please. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeremy, and now we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and we look forward to answering as many questions as we possibly can. I just want to sum this up by saying this. We got a $1.6 billion deficit. There's no doubt about it. We have $2 billion left in savings in the Constitutional Budget Reserve. In 14 months, at the rate of spend that we're spending now, that Constitutional Budget Reserve will be completely empty because we already spent $14 billion in 4 years. The permanent fund dividend under SB 36 is not necessarily the solution for long term. Even if we use all of the PFD and you have 0 PFD, at this rate of spend within 4 years, that PFD is gone. So the Constitutional Budget Reserve theoretically could be gone. The PFD could be gone, and the only thing left is the $16 billion, $17 billion left in the earnings reserve. And if there is anything to be learned from history, when we have money to spend, we spend it. And so we're trying to control that with the constitutional amendments. Jeremy?
So right now, the legislature is looking at using the previous governor's budget to pass and use permanent fund dividends to balance that deficit. That's not all legislators, but that's what it looks like right now most legislators are considering. So we want to make sure you all are aware of opportunities to testify in opposition if you are opposed to that idea. We're sending out messages from the governor's office for folks who sign up here. If you text PLAN to 888-111, we'll send you alerts as to when there are upcoming hearings, and you'll have an opportunity to let your legislators know what you want in a fiscal plan. Thank you.